Hi. Thanks very much to the Provost's office, to CLAS, and to a number of academic departments that supported this event. I first heard about the Government Accountability Project last summer and heard about this tour that was going to college campuses and thought, now this is something our students should hear about before they end up in a situation like this themselves in their future career without having had a chance to think about it first. I'm just going to introduce Lewis Clark, the moderator, who's going to then lead the discussion and introduce you to the other panelists. Or I guess I'm supposed to say Louis. Louis Clark has been with the Government Accountability Project since its earliest days, 1978. He's GAP's president and director of its corporate accountability program. Under his leadership, GAP has been involved in many of the country's highest-profile whistleblower cases. In its early years, it represented hundreds of whistleblowers at numerous nuclear power plants, including 3 Mile Island, exposed the trillion-dollar Star Wars anti-missile project for the boondoggle that it was. More recently, GAP investigated numerous scandals at the World Bank, which resulted in the resignation of Paul Wolfowitz as its president. And they've represented National Security Agency employees who blew the whistle on waste, fraud, and abuse related to the agency's domestic spying program. Louis is widely regarded as one of the country's foremost experts on the whistleblowing experience. Let's welcome Louis Clark.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's really exciting to be here at Franklin and Marshall College. It's really an impressive institution, as you all know. It's a beautiful campus. We've been very well received here already. It's just exciting to be part of your academic program for the next couple of days. And if you can find me over the next 2 days, if you have any follow-up questions, I'm always, hopefully I'll be available. In terms of, I'm going to quickly run through what the Government Accountability Project does, but I want to get to our guests today and essentially my heroes today. First of all, I would like to thank all the actual co-producers of today's event, the Office of the Provost, the Center for Liberal Arts and Society, the Public Affairs Lecture Fund, the Economics Department, the Public Policy Program, and the Office of the President. And I would like to say this, it really is, this is a place we should have started this whistleblower tour. I mean, here at the place created at the time, established at the time of the writing of the Constitution of the United States. I'm impressed with your motto, light and law. Light meaning looking at seeking truth through dialogue, research, and communication with each other. Secondly, in terms of law, the establishment of the rule of law, which not only maintains order, but also preserves freedom. Obviously, those who came from Germany at that time to establish Marshall College were escaping the despotism of Germany. So they came here for freedom. This is an incredible subject matter that we're going to be talking about today. Then turning to the Government Accountability Project very quickly, first of all, we represent whistleblowers. We've represented 5,000 whistleblowers since 1977, which until I came here I thought was really a long time ago, but not so much now. But since 1977, representing whistleblowers. Secondly, is we investigate what they have to say, we try to bring it to national attention, and if appropriate and if possible, we try to create the atmosphere and to accomplish some level of reform about the issue that they present. It's already been talked about in terms of our involvement at TMI. I think that one of our most probably significant cases was really stopping the cleanup operation here for 18 months at TMI, which was essentially had abandoned quality control up until they almost lifted the lid of the reactor with a polar crane that wouldn't have worked. Secondly, we, in terms of involved with nuclear power plants, whistleblowers, again because of problems with quality assurance, halted 3 nuclear power plants because they lacked adequate quality assurance. We have brought national attention to pink slime. A year ago, 85% of the hamburgers in the country contain pink slime. Now, just a fraction of the hamburgers in the country actually have the substance called pink slime. We brought that to national attention. In addition to that, we brought attention to and stopped the manufacture of the Vioxx drug, which essentially killed 50,000 people. It caused heart attacks and strokes to 135,000 people. Merck produced it, developed it, produced it, and was making $2 billion a year with Vioxx until it was removed from the market. There's 4 things we do. The third thing we do is we work on legislation. Over the last 6 years, we have been responsible for developing and successfully getting through Congress whistleblower protections for 100 million workers in the private sector. These include any company that trades on the stock market, any U.S. stock market, and all their subsidiaries. In addition to that, to the healthcare industry, throughout the healthcare industry, also in terms of the banking, in terms of Wall Street, and also banking, with state-of-the-art whistleblower protection. In terms of the manufacture of all products that federal agencies actually regulate, which is something like 14,000 products and involves at least 17 million manufacturing employees, as well as the retailers who sell the products that are manufactured. And we're not done yet, but we are now focused on, and I hope you follow after today, hopefully you'll follow our website, www.whistleblower.org, or just Google Government Accountability Project. We are going to be engaged in whistleblower protection for poultry and meat production, and also at the slaughterhouses. Now, there is whistleblower protection covering all food produced that is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, which is about 70% of the food produced in the United States, but doesn't cover. So, for example, if you have a pizza and there's all those pizzas that had meat on them, those don't have whistleblower protection if you were engaged in producing that. However, if it didn't have meat on it, then you have protections because that's covered by the Food and Drug Administration. That's what we need to change that. So all pizzas need to be covered. The 2 other things of note. Last November, the Congress, if you can imagine, unanimously passed whistleblower protection for all federal employees except those in national security. All other 2 million employees were covered. In addition to that, in December, Congress again unanimously passed whistleblower protection for all contractors to the federal government. That's 14 million people who are now covered that didn't have a cover, that weren't necessarily covered before. And those are the people who are engaged in spending $1.9 trillion of taxpayer money. So those people now have whistleblower protection as of December. And now, next thing in the public sphere that we want to be working on, look at our website again, join any of our petitions, and that is covering people who work for who contract to the national security agencies or who work for the national security agencies. Because right now those people are left out of whistleblower protection. So those are the four things, or those are the three things we do. The fourth thing is we bring public attention to whistleblowers, to the need to protect them, to the value that they add to our society, how they protect each of us in terms of our health and welfare and rights and freedoms and rule of law. And so with that, that's why we're here. So I'll introduce our two heroes. These are my heroes. Hopefully after today, after meeting them, they'll be your heroes as well. And I'll say this, is that I know so much about both of them that if I start talking about them, will take too much time. So I will read each one of their own descriptions and then let them speak for themselves in a question and answer period. First of all, Ken Kendrick, right here in the center. From late 2008 to early 2009, salmonella-tainted peanut butter, originating from the Peanut Corporation of America, sickened 714 people across 46 states, contributing to 9 deaths. Prior to the outbreak, Kendrick, the former Peanut Corporation assistant manager in Plainview, Texas, had made multiple attempts to alert both state and federal officials to numerous public health violations he was witnessing. The widespread salmonella contamination was traced to the corporation's Georgia plant, which used Texas plant materials. Kendrick presented his whistleblowing on Good Morning America, which was to challenge the company's defense that the batch of peanut butter from the Georgia plant was an unexpected and isolated event. Kendrick made clear that the corporation's entire business was based upon risking the health of consumers in order to protect profits. Ken Kendrick. Originally, I was going to have them stand, but they told me they don't want to go that way. So, but my hero, Rick Piltz. In 2005, Rick Piltz was a senior associate in the coordination office of the U.S. Climate Change Science Program. He became aware that White House officials were improperly editing and censoring scientific program reports on global warming intended for the public and Congress. In short, the White House was editing out scientific findings on the strong human impact on climate change, essentially making the science fit the policy. Rick contacted GAP, and we released these edited reports to the New York Times that documented the actual hand editing by White House official Philip Cooney, a lawyer and former climate team leader with the American Petroleum Institute. This scandal sparked a media frenzy that resulted in Cooney's resignation. He found a job a few days later at ExxonMobil, which I don't think he ever left, but anyway. With Piltz's leadership, in 2006, GAP launched Climate Science Watch, an education and advocacy project dedicated to holding public officials accountable for their use of climate science and related research in policymaking. Rick Piltz. Rick, let's begin with you. Let's get a better sense of what you found when you went to that federal agency.
Well, I had been working in the coordination office of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, Climate Change Science Program, since 1995. I was there for 10 years altogether. And this is an office that supports the multi-agency $2 billion federal scientific research program on climate and global environment. One of the things that I did was to develop and edit reports to Congress, things that had to do with strategic planning for the research program. I didn't control the $2 billion. That was done in the federal agencies. So this was an office that was kind of, on the one side, had the federal science experts and managers and scientists, and on the other side had the White House and the political world. And when the Bush administration came in 2001, we started to notice a difference in how they were handling climate science communication. I was told early on to remove all the pages and the references to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Scientific Assessment, which is the big international climate science assessment, and references to the National Assessment of Climate Change Impacts, a major study that had just been completed by our program over a period of several years, from the next report to Congress. So essentially what they were starting to do was to play down the global warming problem by blocking communication of climate science that was aimed at informing policymakers and the public. It wasn't censoring the science that was done and published in the scientific technical journals. Where the political gatekeepers stepped in was the communication to wider audiences. And in one really set of striking examples, draft copies that had been signed off on by all the federal agencies as ready for publication, needing only a final White House clearance, would come back to me over the fax machine with the hand markups by the Chief of Staff at the White House Environmental Office, showing all the things he wanted taken out and all the changes in wording he wanted. And it was all designed systematically to play down global warming. And it appeared to me that this was illegitimate political interference with scientific communication on a problem that absolutely depends on clear, honest communication between the science community, the public, the policymakers, if we're going to be able to deal with it effectively. And that was early on in the Bush administration, and there were multiple additional examples that I observed later and that came out from other sources later about censoring lab scientists, taking down websites, misrepresenting issues in congressional testimony, and so forth. And so it appeared that an administration that did not want to regulate greenhouse gases or the energy industry and did not have a proactive view of government was willing to spin and misrepresent the scientific communication in order to conform the science to their politics rather than take the science and what the experts were saying and make policy on that basis. And we were caught in the middle of that in that office. We could see it. It came at us from both sides.
Yeah, what'd you do?
Well, I started documenting what I was seeing, those faxed copies before I passed them on or before I dealt with them. I made copies and took them home. And I protested internally, not to the White House. I mean, that would have immediately, caused me an unemployment problem, which I was not ready to deal with at that point, but to the director of my office and to the official at the National Science Foundation who chaired the science program, saying, look, this is what they're telling us to do with the report. I don't think it's legitimate. But it essentially fell on deaf ears. I mean, the feds were not willing to rock the boat politically when they were getting signals from the White House that this was politically sensitive. And so people started self-censoring. Over a period of time, I documented in a number of ways what I observed going on in the political manipulation of the science program, to the point where I had a long list of bullet items about how the leadership of the program in the White House were kind of running this thing off the rails. And finally, in 2005, at the beginning of the second Bush administration, it became apparent in a number of ways that the policing was going to get worse rather than better. And I finally just threw up my hand. I mean, I felt I was blocked, and it was really an intolerable situation to be in. And one day just find myself saying, okay, that's it. I can't work on this project under these conditions. And I hadn't been intending to do that morning, but that's what happened during the day. And after a long conversation with the White House political appointee who was in charge of the program that got nowhere, I turned in my resignation, and with the intention of doing some public speaking and turning some things over to the press. But first I went and talked to the lawyers at Gap to see what kind of exposure I might have about turning over internal documents. It's a situation it was quite different from anything that I'd ever experienced before, and I didn't know what might happen. But we put the story out there, and it ended up getting a lot of coverage because I think it spoke to something that people were perceiving about the administration, about their willingness to misrepresent intelligence in order to suit political objectives. And I just happened to be observing the global warming chapter of that problem and how it could lead to failures of preparedness.
Okay, Ken, now we're going to change subjects. What did you find at your place of work?
Well, when I was hired there, I was hired more, I was called production planner. It's kind of an organizational role. And within a few weeks of working there, I'd found it odd. I'd worked in a meat testing lab before I came there, and as I started learning this process, I was supposed to organize what peanuts came in, what we would turn them into. Nothing to do with quality assurance whatsoever. As it turns out, no one at the plant had a quality assurance role. It really is kind of funny, and we do need to laugh about that because you've got to find some humor in this, as sad as it was. I've been there a couple of weeks, and they were about to have a second Nestle audit. And, Nestle, the big name company Nestle, and the manager and owner informed me, hey, Nestle's coming for a second audit. Pretty much told me to shut up. And I was like, well, can I see the first audit so I know what we're talking about? So this is in July of 2006. Nestle had audited them in January of 2006 and just ripped them apart. I mean, does not meet in every area imaginable. And in July, the owner and other plant managers from Georgia are about to fly down to Texas. And I'm going, wait a minute, you mean it's been this bad for 6 months and you guys are just now maybe wanting to address these problems, rodent control, testing? I was like, oh my gosh. So they're frantically trying to throw everything together, and I knew we had roof leaks, just all sorts of problems, and I was really surprised there wasn't testing. I'd worked in a meat testing lab, and they would send us samples every hour. And at the peanut plant, it was only when the customer requested it, so we could be producing items for 2-3 weeks without any lab tests being done whatsoever. I was no expert in this area, but I thought, that's really not right. I'd called the plant manager in Georgia and was like, kind of what's our standard for doing this? And he was like, till the customer asks for one, don't deal with it. Well, what are the parameters? I wanted actual counts, like how much salmonella is considered acceptable. And no one in any of the plants knew. I had to look it up on the Department of Agriculture website to even know what the acceptable levels were. So when I got a lab report, I could look at it and go, wow, this is over the limit or under the limit, or this is acceptable or this is not acceptable. So that was my first inkling that we were in over our heads on this is not a first-class operation. And Nestle coming back, and even during the second audit, of course, we're not showing them the doors with the flooded basements, and they're covering things up, and I'm frantically trying to write new reports and set up some testing from the deficiencies they had found before. So I knew what was going on was definitely not an acceptable standard, even though the owner of the company was on the Peanut Standard Board. He had been put there by the Bush administration, and he didn't even know what the lab testing requirements were, what an acceptable amount of E. coli was, or salmonella, or anything else. And the funnier part was they had me watch, if you ever watched How It's Made, they did this big special on peanut butter. And I saw that, and it's this first-class operation, and what I was looking in looked like something out of the 1950s. So I'm going, well, yeah, I really wish y'all hadn't had me watch that documentary, because now I see what it's supposed to be like and what I'm working in, and this is very disgusting. But I saw flooded basements, leaking roofs, and, common sense there.
What's the problem with leaking roofs?
Basically, think about you have birds on roofs, birds crap on the roof, and the water runs in.
Okay.
There you go. There's a potential source of salmonella, not to mention something you probably don't want to be eating, which a lot of people did. And then, I'd also like to point out there, too, when we look at the number of deaths and illnesses, my research, and this is just my personal research, shows it's really a 30-to-1 ratio. For each death or illness you know about, there's 30 that you don't know about. And that's what made this become the largest recall in U.S. history. This was an ingredient-borne outbreak, meaning these peanuts go into everything, and so it really multiplied really quick. And it was the same strain of salmonella at the Texas and Georgia plants, according to New England Journal of Medicine. So we don't even know where it originated from.
So what did you do with these horrific conditions?
Well, first I called my old lab manager from the meat testing lab, and I was trying to set up an environmental testing program. I was trying to get in compliance with what Nestle wanted, realizing that was just about impossible. We had some other ethical issues going on with the owner. And quite simply, he wouldn't put up the money to fix the roof. This was an extremely old building. It was originally a sausage factory back in the 1950s that they had bought. And I was sending emails to the Texas Department of Health and saying, in Texas, the way it works, the FDA and Texas work is the Texas Department of Health notifies the FDA of the list of operating companies. And based on that, the FDA or the Texas Department of Health will do an inspection. Well, we had organic certification. So in my mind, okay, we have organic certification, looked up the law, you're licensed by the Texas Department of Health. I'm sending emails to the Texas Department of Health and the FDA, but the Department of Agriculture employee had checked off that this plant was certified by the Department of Health. They had never registered with the Department of Health, so they had never been inspected. Even though the Texas Wastewater Runoff Commission had been there, OSHA, everyone else, the people I was sending the emails to and people I was trying to alert of flooded basements and bad conditions, not including management, didn't even know the plant existed. Now, there was this huge billboard in front of the local health that said, Peanut Corp of America, outlet store, local health department said, well, we didn't know they were selling peanuts there. There's a billboard, those huge billboards pointing right to it, 300 yards from their office. The health inspector had drove right by the sign, he said, numerous times going from Lubbock to Amarillo on a major interstate. But there was complete denial that they knew the plant existed at all. So it just flew under the radar. And then, of course, later we found out there were 355 facilities in Texas that had never registered, and not a single one of them were fined for not registering or being inspected.
So let's advance it a bit. What did you do later on and why?
I just stayed there for about 4 months and left. I had tried to set up a QA program. I'd started environmental testing. The second big red flag, and this is what had got me doing some emails, a plant manager from another state really wanted this Nestle contract, and the manager and I both knew there was no way. Had suggested when I started doing this environmental testing that, and he didn't tell me to, he just said, if you'd microwave the sponges, and the sponges are what you use to get the testing, the results would look better and we would be more likely to get the contract and you might get a raise. So basically, in a roundabout way, I was being told to microwave the sponges and send them to a lab. That's the point I decided, okay, I'm out of here. But I wrote a policy, and this is just totally my own, brought in my former lab manager, tried to set up a real quality assurance program handed it off, and left. I had done everything I could by email. I didn't know anything about GAAP. I was doing everything anonymously because I can't afford attorneys. This is a $12 an hour job. I didn't know what GAAP was or any whistleblower organization was. No clue how to go about this. I didn't realize that when I handed this off to the next person, who eventually became the QA manager, was she had an 8th grade education and couldn't pass her GED, but she became the QA manager for this plant. So, I mean, the word salmonella meant absolutely nothing to her, but that was who this was handed off to. Very, very scary. So here I'd wrote all these procedures and complex things to do on lab testing, and it was being handed off to someone who couldn't pass a GED.
And, okay, what happened years later? Or 2 years
Well, then, in 2009, I was working for an orthopedic company as an office manager. And we're all talking jobs here. These are like $12 an hour jobs. And I saw on the news where this peanut outbreak had started and might be going to Peanut Corp of America. So once again, I went crazy sending emails to every state Department of Health where this was affected. And so at the time I was doing the emails, we're talking 20 or 30 different states. FDA, Department of Agriculture. I mean, I'm just sending emails left and right. Media, CNN, CBS, local news, everybody. And while I'm doing this, I have my granddaughter sitting in front of me eating Austin peanut butter and crackers made by Kellogg's. You see them in the convenience stores all the time still. Sorry, I get a little bit choked up when we start talking about this. And I'm reading this information on the website that they've never found salmonella. They do rigorous testing. I'm like, well, maybe they do now, but they didn't when I worked there. And an organization called Safe Table Our Priorities, and they're now just called Stop Foodborne Illness, was the only one to respond to me. All the Department of Health and everything gave me that generic, you get the email automated response, yeah, we're looking into it, blah, 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 blah. I'm not satisfied with this answer. I'm going, okay, guys, something's wrong here. And while I'm sending these emails, my granddaughter, who was 2 at the time, is just puking her guts out. And my mother-in-law had cancer, was living with us, palliative care, about to die, eating these crackers. I never in a million years would have guessed that Kellogg's would have bought peanut butter from Peanut Corp. Well, guess what? This bit me in the butt. It shows up on the recall list. I was feeding my granddaughter and mother-in-law recalled Austin crackers that contained salmonella from a plant that I had worked at 3 years earlier. And she's continuing to get sicker and sicker. Now, when I stopped giving them to her, within 48 hours, she was fine. And it was the specific lot recall. So at this point, it's beyond, I'm trying to get someone's attention to, I am pissed. Very personal at this point. And with Safe Tables, I just kind of said, screw the cloak of anonymity here, use my name. And we went to the New York Times, and within 48 hours, I was on Good Morning America. They really messed up the story, but it did at least make them go look at the Texas plant. At that point, they had not even stepped into the Texas plant, knowing that Georgia was recalling everything that they were making. No one had still went to the Texas plant. It made no sense to me.
And about editorialize, as a result of your coming forward, the plant went off the cliff. It would have survived. Well, that's the question I should be asking. But Rick, what about the other people at the office? Why didn't they blow the whistle?
It's an interesting question. It's something I always think about. Why taking that action was so unusual, and I think that most of the people who run the science program are career federal officials, and there are many ways to rationalize not taking action. You jeopardize your position, you jeopardize your career. There's really no way that you can be protected from retaliation, or at least you feel there is. I think people's had the sense that, well, it's not going to do any good. it'll just get me in trouble. Someone else will come along and they won't be as good as I am in this position. I heard one person say, well, they won the election. They have the right to do whatever they want. And my response was, but the science program is not part of the political apparatus of the White House. I mean, you have the politicals, and then you have the science people. But they were intimidated, and there was a lot of it didn't require a whole lot of overt censorship. It was like anticipatory self-censorship sets in. Now, once I had resigned, I learned a lot about from how people reacted to that, because when I would appear at a public event at which that community of people would be there were those who would go out of their way to be seen talking with me as almost like a gesture of support. And there were others that I had known for years who I could see walking the long way around the room to avoid having to cross my paths, maybe because they would feel like they might get problems for being seen with a whistleblower, or maybe they didn't approve of what I had done. A lot of the communications I got were offline. People would come to me with inside information and say, well, you really ought to know about what's going on with the Public Affairs Office and NOAA and how we have to clear all of our science press releases with essentially the oil industry lobbyist in the White House Environmental Office, and how they won't do a press release on major scientific studies if they think that the science will embarrass the administration politically. So a lot of what I had to do was cultivate a network and a support system that was below the radar and help bring information out that was provided by people who were not in a position to speak publicly. Because, it was true in a lot of places, but certainly in Washington, a lot of what you do is you trade your freedom of public speech for inside influence. I mean, people know so much more than they will ever tell the public because they think that they can do some good having some influence on the inside, and you don't just sort of go and talk about everything that you learn. And to me, it got to a point where I was seeing a whole cadre of skillful, professional people kind of fall silent in the face of really egregious political interference. It was very troubling to me. One of the reasons I resigned finally is I couldn't find anyone on the inside with greater influence than I who would really champion, overtly the values that I thought we were trying to promote, which is to sort of communicate the state of climate science into the policy process so society can figure out how to manage these risks that were being identified by the science community. So, I think people have a lot of ways of talking themselves out of it, but I know that a lot of the senior staff in the office thought the same way I did and were very supportive. They just had to be very careful about how they showed their support.
What about the other people at your job?
Well, of course, at Peanut Corp, I was just happy to leave. But what had happened later, I was working at an orthopedic company, and immediately after I went on Good Morning America, which was the only way to get anybody to look at the Texas plant, I was told by another employee, watch out, they want to get rid of you. It took them 9 months, and I had to go to the hospital, and I was basically fired from the emergency room. And since then, and even my last job, I'm not working now. I'm on the blacklist, so that's it. I cannot find a job, can't afford to move, lost my house, car, totally isolated in my area. And have been told in interviews that I am not being hired because I am a whistleblower. 3 separate interviews, I've been told that. We recognize you from the news. We love you. You're overqualified. Can't touch you. Sorry. Thank you for what you've done.
And you still live in the town where the plant was closed down?
Yeah, I've moved to a little town. I'd lived in Lubbock and commuted to a little town called Plainview. I've lost my house and moved since then. Like we discussed when I was driving up here, I wound up taking a part-time minimum wage job at a call center. And even there, someone was letting Blue Cross know how bad this call center was. And I was called into HR 4 separate times and interrogated, basically going, are you the one sending these emails to Blue Cross about how bad this company is? And I was like, no, backtrack the IP address, do whatever you got to do. Finally, on the fourth time, they transferred me to being a directory assistance operator, and a week later closed down the department. So obviously that was their way of getting rid of me to make sure I wasn't the inside mole. And that's the stereotype of whistleblowers. They think we run around telling everything. And I was like, well, no, that's not the case. I just, I want a job. This isn't anything. Now, if you're killing people, we have a problem. I didn't stay much in touch with too many people who'd worked at Peanut Corp, and the FBI has still kind of got me where I'm really not supposed to talk about some of the details on there. They really don't like me talking to the plant manager I used to work with. He was fired right after I left, and so from what I understand, a lot of the quality assurance standards I tried to set up never stayed in place after I left. And if you ever look online at what the FDA, I had to draw maps for the FDA. It was ridiculous. It took them 3 inspections going out there to find what they needed to. We literally had to sit down and draw. Did you look in this store and see this flooded basement? Did you look into the crawl space? And once they did, they found dead rodents everywhere. Just some really, really disgusting issues. But very isolated.
Does bird dew qualify as organic, by the way?
I believe technically it is organic.
Okay.
And what's funny is the organic supplier, and y'all may have seen this on the news, Sunland Peanuts just had a huge recall 97 miles from Peanut Corp. Was their organic supplier for Peanut Corp. And they were just on the news a couple of weeks ago. The first time that the FDA ever had the authority, and this is a result of Peanut Corp. I find it kind of ironic that the FDA was able to shut down the plant. At the time when I was at Peanut Corp, the FDA could not legally shut down the plant without going to court, no matter how bad it was. So Sunland, who was Peanut Corp's supplier for organic products, is kind of our first test, and they used their authority to shut down Sunland until they came into compliance. So I found that interesting.
I would like to add as well, is because of your case and the case of a few others, but we now have state-of-the-art whistleblower protection for people engaged in the production of food, again, that is regulated by the FDA. Rick, what would have happened? I know that also not only did your whistleblowing create headlines all over the country and the world, actually, but also there was an entire program, very sophisticated program, going into 13 different agencies to suppress climate science. Very well orchestrated PR campaign to control the information. I know that also came down in part as a reaction or response to your whistleblowing. But what can you speculate a little bit about what you think would have happened had you not blown the whistle?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm not sure. I think that what my story did was it sort of framed a narrative for people for how to think about the administration's relationship to the global warming problem, and that in connection with a number of other things that were happening in the same period. Pressure from some of the other governments in the G8, especially the British Prime Minister, the Hurricane Katrina devastating New Orleans, and the administration's obvious complete lack of preparedness for dealing with this kind of a disaster, and almost disclaiming any responsibility for anticipating such disasters. In conjunction with a number of things, by the end of the next year, we saw in the leading U.S. media less of a tendency to cover the climate change problem as well, this side says this, but on the other hand, we have this scientist over here who doesn't agree, and covering it more as a straightforward science story where you really ought to focus on what the leading, most credible experts are saying. And I think it also caused people to have a more critical perspective on the administration. It did not cause the administration to change their policy, but by the time we got to the end of 2008, to the transition between the Bush administration and the Obama administration, we saw less of an overt pattern of censorship within the administration. They still would not allow EPA to move forward with regulating greenhouse gases under this Clean Air Act, even though there had been a Supreme Court ruling that they needed to move on that. They still would not let the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention go testify before the Senate on the human health implications of global warming. When scientific reports would come out from the government program, they would allow the report to be published and written straight, but there would be no press release. It would just kind of like be a stealth release that you had to know it was there, or you wouldn't even know it existed. The findings were not discussed or embraced by political officials. So we backed them off on the worst of the censorship. But by that point, they had made it clear that they weren't going to move on the policy. The scientists could say anything they wanted. Nothing was going to happen. So I think perhaps it contributed to people being able to see the problem in a new way, and the problem of holding public officials accountable, that wouldn't have happened in quite the same way if we hadn't put out inside information. And I think there's a lot of it. I think that there ought to be a very great deal more whistleblowing than we see going on. I've come to appreciate it as an underutilized and sometimes underappreciated form of public service. There's a lot of stuff that is kept secret in government that really doesn't have anything whatsoever to do with national security, but that is politically embarrassing to the powers that be, and that would be a benefit for the public if people on the inside who know what's actually going on would be more forthcoming about bringing it forward. And of course, you take risks when you do that.
And Ken, what do you think would have happened?
Well, on mine, when I first got with Safe Tables, our main objective was to get someone to the Texas peanut plant. I was just flabbergasted that this place was not being inspected. So I don't know how much longer they would have stayed open before somebody put two and two together going, hey, they have two more plants. There was another one in Virginia. How much longer it would have stayed open. And we know it was the same strain of salmonella at both plants. So my fear is that this plant would have stayed open for months, maybe past inspection, since they didn't apparently know how to go upstairs and look. I don't know how many more people might have became ill or died had this plant not finally been shut down. And then once they were shut down, they recalled every product ever produced at that plant from the day it was opened to show you how bad the conditions were. So in mine, we accomplished the objective on this disgusting plant needs to be shut down. What I'm saying is true. It's got to be shut down. It finally was. And then when they finally discovered these other 355 plants, also as a result of this, are 355 producers that had never registered with the Department of Health, thus that were never investigated. I don't know how many of those facilities could have been doing other things.
Just this final question before opening up to everybody. It's a two-part question, though. Rick, would you do it again, and what do you have to say to folks here that are just almost going to go into careers here?
Yes, definitely. I think that taking action on this is one of the best things that I've done. And I came out of it in pretty decent shape, except for taking a large financial hit. But, I didn't get prosecuted or persecuted. I got investigated, but I got support. The people paid attention to what I was trying to say. and I was able to go ahead and develop an independent project. And so I reclaimed, my public voice, my freedom of speech, and my ability to continue to pursue the issues that I was concerned with.
And what about the folks here?
Excuse me?
What do you have to say to these folks?
And, well, I think it's entirely possible that you find yourself in a position, whether you're working in government or in the private sector, where you find yourself at odds with those who are in the power structure above you. Now, in some cases, it's just you disagree with particular decisions, but you don't feel like your own fundamental values are being compromised, or your ability, to your job is being compromised. But sometimes it turns out that you witness something that is just you have to honestly say to yourself that it's really over the line, whether it's actual criminal behavior or whether it's just an abuse of power that is, really against the public interest, and that is so violates your own values that you feel like to continue to participate in that context makes you complicit somehow. And I've become very sensitized to what I call these complicity issues. If you go along, at what point do you become complicit in what you're rationalizing yourself out of taking action on?
So be prepared. We got to.
But not to go off half-cocked. I mean, document. Be careful about what you say to whom. Get good counsel. Have a plan. Think carefully about what you're doing, and be intelligent about it, and not step carelessly into something where you'll get slammed down and not be able to do any good with it.
And Ken, would you do it again?
In my case, I had no choice. People were dying, so I'm not going to call myself like, oh, this was a big moral dilemma. When people are dying, you don't have a choice. Now, in my case, I didn't handle this well. I didn't know about GAAP. I knew Peanut Corp had attorneys who would sue the crap out of me at the first chance they got. If you met this owner, you would understand what I mean by that. So, I didn't handle it well. I would have to do it again because people were dying, and I've hugged the mother of a dead child from this. So, yes, I would have to do it again.
And what would you have to say to these folks?
And even though this is, it's been a devastating toll on my life, and I try to simplify it. When you come across this dilemma, and I don't even put it if, it could be tomorrow or it can be 40 years from now, you're going to come across a moral, ethical, legal dilemma of major significance. Don't turn in every little thing. I'm not saying that. But when you hit this major issue, you're going to have to do whatever it is you can do to sleep at night. You're going to have to just gauge your personal moral value. Know you're going to be taking risk, but can you live with yourself? And just make the decision on, can I live with myself by ignoring this, or can I live with myself by acting on it? So
let's open it to questions. We have very little time, but let's move quickly to your mics, and we'll go as long as we can. Thanks.
Although we have time for a few questions that are publicly, after 12:35, if you have more questions, feel free to come up. And over in Bonchek College House, right after this, there will be a discussion on climate change and climate policy. Thanks.
And also, turn in the valuations at the table back there, if you would.
Hi, my name's Amalia Handler, and I'm a senior at Franklin and Marshall. And this question is for Mr. Clark. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the whistleblower protections are, because you mentioned those a lot in your introduction, but what do those protections actually look like?
What the protection, first of all, is that you have a legal right to blow the whistle. So essentially, it's extending the First Amendment to your job. So you have the freedom to speak out. Secondly, is that you actually there's a whole process by which you can prove that. And how that's set up very quickly is that if you show that your whistleblowing had something to do with your retaliation or your termination or whatever, if you can show there's any connection, then the burden switches to your employer to prove by clear and convincing evidence, which is a very high standard, that you should not be reinstated. So, and So that's a very different standard than what used to exist. Yes.
Hi, my name's Cameron Koob. I'm a freshman. I'm just curious for both of you, especially Mr. Kendrick, because there were hundreds of other plants that hadn't been registered and could have just as easily had as many problems as the one you worked at. Why do you think there weren't any whistleblowers before yourself? Would it be like an obedience to authority kind of thing, or did it have to do with fear of the kind of devastating financial impact on people's lives? What do you think it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely fear has a lot to do with it, and it did with me too. That's why I kind of stayed anonymous. And there was the fear of being sued. You got to remember, Texas is a very conservative state, and Lubbock, which is pretty close to where this is, was already the second most conservative city in the nation, behind Provo, Utah. The federal judge there has ruled EEOC, any employment case, in favor of the employee less than 1% of the time. About 80% of the cases are summarily dismissed. You get sued, there's no recourse. On the other 355 plants, and this is the part I find interesting, after being called, a former presidential candidate from Texas, press secretary, actually called me an asshole on the telephone for turning them in. That'll give you an idea of the mentality that we're dealing with. And they did not find one of these 355 facilities. When I said, if I'm going 80 in a school zone, I have to pay a ticket. These guys aren't following the law. Why don't they? Objects to get them into compliance. So I'm not in a state that is very employee friendly, to put it mildly. And so I think a lot of it has to do with fear. Yeah, the fear was definitely the big factor.
Next question here.
Drew Mitchell. I'm a senior sociology major. This question is for Mr. Clark. Both of our guests have done brilliant work, but I was wondering how far you would take the definition of whistleblower. Would you consider Bradley Manning a whistleblower?
Actually, yeah, he is a whistleblower. I would. Bradley, I'm not saying, there aren't problems with what Bradley Manning did. But yeah, he's a whistleblower. I mean, he blew the whistle on collateral damage video, which really is essentially the shooting down of citizens like it was a video game. Yeah, they came out because of Bradley Manning. I'm not saying that it's okay to leak classified information if he's adjudicated guilty of that potential crime.
Thank you.
Thanks. My name's Andrew Foley. I'm a senior. This question's for Mr. Piltz. You mentioned that you were kind of the intermediary between the science community and the policy and political world. And you mentioned it was you saw it as your civic duty to kind of blow the whistle on this. What do you think about the civic duty of the scientists who had published the results but may not have followed up on whether the press releases were sent out and the proper policy decisions being made based on their results? Do you think it was their duty to kind of support you or to bring this more to the attention of the public?
Most scientists want to steer clear of politics. I don't expect them to do too much in the way of being activists. Their day jobs are pretty consuming, and they tend to be conflict averse. But on the other hand, the climate science community of all of them has made something of a heroic effort over the past few decades to communicate their findings to the public and policymakers in accessible assessments and interviews and testimony and public speaking and so forth. So I think that they've mostly done their job, and the problems are much more on the political side than on the science side. I have a very good relationship with a number of the leading climate scientists. I particularly come across those who do make the effort to speak out, basically, who do know how to talk to civilians in more or less plain English and do want to see this problem get communicated. My interaction with them has generally been pretty positive, and I think that there's a lot of good comes out of that community.
We have one more question. That's it.
My name is Liat Kastner, and I'm a freshman. You talked about the censoring of information between scientists and politicians with the Bush administration. Have you seen any differences with the Obama administration in terms of that censoring of information?
Well, none of them are above criticism, I'll tell you that. But the Obama administration, I don't see the same kind of denial or kind of political interference with the science communication, but where sometimes they have not been averse to like setting science aside when it's politically inconvenient for decision making. I mean, the Environmental Protection Agency had a new rule on smog that was going to tighten the air quality standards that called for under the Clean Air Act and advised by their science board, and the big corporate interests went to the White House and said, don't make us do this regulation, it's going to cost us money. And Obama wouldn't let EPA go forward with it. At least it was kind of like, take that down until after the election. The allowing Shell to try to drill for oil in the Arctic Ocean. I mean, if there's ever a spill up there, it's going to be like, wow. And there are major unresolved environmental science and technical issues with that. But they've allowed them to go ahead anyway. With climate change, I think President Obama understands the problem. He has a science advisor who's very good on this. John Holdren is a Harvard professor. But since about 2009, he doesn't seem to want to talk about climate change. He's never really given a big talk about it. He'll talk about clean energy. So there's like a silence, basically, about it. You know, so it's setting the science aside. It's not censoring it. It's not using it when they're not ready to want to find it politically convenient to use it.
And I think you were arrested at the White House, right? But anyway, for the next time.
Protesting the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline, yes, some of us had to go down and sit in and get busted last year.
I think it is. I would like to thank the people on the stage, not only for the presentation today, but also for their public service. Thank you guys so very much.
Stock market and all their subsidiaries. In addition to that, to the healthcare industry, throughout the healthcare industry, also in terms of the banking, in terms of Wall Street, and also banking with state-of-the-art whistleblower protection, in terms of the manufacture of all products that federal agencies actually regulate, which is something like 14,000 products and involves at least 17 million manufacturing employees, as well as the retailers who sell the products that are manufactured. And we're not done yet, but we are now focused on, and I hope you follow after today, hopefully you'll follow our website, www.whistleblower.org, or just Google Government Accountability Project. We are going to be engaged in whistleblower protection for poultry and meat production, and also at the slaughterhouses. Now, there is whistleblower protection covering all food produced that is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, which is about 70% of the food produced in the United States, but doesn't cover. So, for example, if you have a pizza and there's all those pizzas that had meat on them, those don't have whistleblower protection if you were engaged in producing that. However, if it didn't have meat on it, then you have protections because that's covered by the Food and Drug Administration. That's.
Hi. Thanks very much to the Provost's Office, to CLAS, and to a number of academic departments that supported this event. I first heard about the Government Accountability Project last summer and heard about this tour that was going to college campuses and thought, now this is something our students should hear about. before they end up in a situation like this themselves in their future career without having had a chance to think about it first. I'm just going to introduce Lewis Clark, the moderator, who's going to then lead the discussion and introduce you to the other panelists. Or I guess I'm supposed to say Louis. Louis Clark has been with the Government Accountability Project since its earliest days, 1978. He's GAP's president and director of its Corporate Accountability Program. Under his leadership, GAP has been involved in many of the country's highest-profile whistleblower cases. In its early years, it represented hundreds of whistleblowers at numerous nuclear power plants, including 3 Mile Island, exposed the trillion-dollar Star Wars anti-missile project for the boondoggle that it was. More recently, GAP investigated numerous scandals at the World Bank, which resulted in the resignation of Paul Wolfowitz as its president. Then they've represented National Security Agency employees who blew the whistle on waste, fraud, and abuse related to the agency's domestic spying.
Seeking truth through dialogue, research, and communication with each other. Secondly, in terms of law, the establishment of the rule of law, which not only maintains order, but also preserves freedom. Obviously, those who came from Germany at that time to establish Marshall College were escaping the despotism of Germany. So they came here for freedom. This is an incredible subject matter that we're going to be talking about today. Then turning to the Government Accountability Project very quickly. First of all, we represent whistleblowers. We've represented 5,000 whistleblowers since 1977, which until I came here I thought was really a long time ago, but not so much now. But since 1977, representing whistleblowers. Secondly, is we investigate what they have to say, we try to bring it to national attention, and if appropriate and if possible, we try to create the atmosphere and to accomplish some level of reform about the issue that they present. It's already been talked about in terms of our involvement at TMI. I think that one of our most probably significant cases was really stopping the cleanup operation here for 18 months at TMI, which was essentially had abandoned quality control up until they almost lifted the lid of the reactor with a polar crane that wouldn't have worked. Secondly, we, in terms of involved with nuclear power plants, whistleblowers, again because of problems with quality assurance, halted 3 nuclear power plants because they lacked adequate quality assurance. We have brought national attention to pink slime. A year ago, 85% of the hamburgers in the country contain pink slime. Now, just a fraction of the hamburgers in the country actually have the substance called pink slime. We brought that to national attention. In addition to that, we brought attention to and stopped the manufacture of the Vioxx drug, which essentially killed 50,000 people. It caused heart attacks and strokes to 135,000 people. Merck produced it, developed it, produced it, and was making $2 billion a year with Vioxx until it was removed from the market. There's 4 things we do. The third thing we do is we work on legislation. Over the last 6 years, we have been responsible for developing and successfully getting through Congress whistleblower protections for 100 million workers in the private sector. These include any company that trades on the stock market, any U.S.
program. Louis is widely regarded as one of the country's foremost experts on the whistleblowing experience. Let's welcome Louis Clark.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's really exciting to be here at Franklin and Marshall College. It's really an impressive institution, as you all know. It's a beautiful campus. We've been very well received here already. It's just exciting to be part of your academic program for the next couple of days. And if you can find me over the next 2 days, if you have any follow-up questions, I'm always, hopefully I'll be available. In terms of, I'm going to quickly run through what the Government Accountability Project does, but I want to get to our guests today and essentially my heroes today. First of all, I would like to thank all the actual co-producers of today's event, the Office of the Provost, the Center for Liberal Arts and Society, the Public Affairs Lecture Fund, the Economics Department, the Public Policy Program, and the Office of the President. And I would like to say this, it really is, this is a place we should have started this whistleblower tour. I mean, here at the place, created at the time, established at the time of the writing of the Constitution of the United States. I'm impressed with your motto, light and law, light meaning look